I hope you all brought your imaginative glasses with you today, because we're going to look at some things we have known, or at least heard, in a slightly different way. We're going to start off with a brief history lesson to put things in proper proportion. Roughly 13.7 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang. And we believe the universe we know came into existence. It took a little over 9 billion years for the stars to be born and die cataclysmically, creating the elements and stuff necessary for our planet Earth to be formed. About 4.5 billion years ago, our sun, our whole solar system, and our planet condensed out of that cloud of stellar debris. A few hundred million years later, the first forms of life may have appeared under conditions that would be highly inimical to life today. Life continued to develop from those first primitive forms. At some point, around 4 billion years ago, an organism called LUCA is thought to have existed. LUCA was the last universal common ancestor of all life on our planet. All plant, animal, and fungal life are believed to have developed from LUCA. Viruses and plasmids may have had a slightly different story, but the point is that the chemical reaction we call life started over 4 billion years ago and is continuing today. And I am suggesting that all life, from those beginning forms to the myriad of creatures inhabiting our world today, is one single continuous chemical reaction, and therefore a single entity, one life form. I would like to have had a name for that entity. I would like to have used Gaia, but the name has been overused, and I didn't want any confusion with James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis' Gaia hypothesis, which is a very different concept, but could be really interesting if you combine the hypothesis with what I'm talking about today. So I will continue to describe this as the entity. I think of the entity as a tree in which each of what we have called life forms, for example, a cat, a flower plant, a dinosaur, myself, or you, are leaves on that tree. We bud, mature, perform our work for the tree, and then we wither, the process I personally am going through currently. And then we become part of the planet again, my version of dust to dust. The entity's leaves comprise the ecosystems that have existed for the last 4 billion years. Each of those leaves performing a function supporting the entity. In this way, I've been alive for 4 billion years. And remember that in this conceptualization, I includes you and all past and present life. We are part of the same continuing chemical reaction or entity. So, the question is, other than as an exercise for our neurocortex, is there anything to be gained or learned from thinking about life in this way, that is, as a single 4 billion year old entity, or as opposed to the classical way, as a sequence of isolated life forms which are born, mature, reproduce, and die, and over time evolve? In the time available this morning, we can't get very deeply into any of these possibilities, but we can point towards some interesting directions for contemplation. For example, in this conceptualization, evolution gets replaced by development. Each component life form develops to optimize its role in supporting the entity. Photosynthetic life converts solar energy to chemical energy that can be used by other life. The various food chains on the planet can be seen as nutrient transfer mechanisms in the structure of the entity. The collection of leaves that comprise humanity are unique in that we are capable of developing a conceptual framework in which we can perceive the entity as a whole and its relationship to the universe. Are we the mechanisms by which the entity is trying to understand itself? This requires us to think of ourselves differently. But changing our perceptions of ourselves isn't new. 50 years ago, we used to think that all the cells in a person's body were descended from one's parents. And any other life forms that were living in or on our bodies were either disease or infection. Today we know that that is much more complex. According to the National Institute of Health, there are 10 times as many non-dense organisms in my body as there are dense cells, and they are required for me to be healthy. Here I'm defining dense cells as those derived from my parents' DNA, and non-dense as something else. I feel this concept of my body as a collective, as opposed to a monocellular entity, has changed my perception of the relationship between me and the rest of the entity I am describing today. For me, it's been easier than the concept of a single 4-billion-year-old entity than it was to relate an isolated me to that entity. Further, if we think of all life on the single planet, there is only I. There could not be a you or a they, because for there to be a you or a they, there would have to be a second entity. And for purposes of what I am suggesting today, there is only one. Everything is I. From the plants we ate for breakfast, the trees from which our houses were built. That makes our seventh principle all the more important. In that, it becomes the entity and that web, interdependent web of all existence. And I'll leave you with what to me is one of the more interesting speculations. We could be far older. What if that chemical reaction didn't start on Earth? We know that the Goldilocks conditions Earth experiences are common in our galaxy. Goldilocks conditions are when a planet is just close enough to its star to have liquid water on the surface. That initial chemical key that started the entity could have arrived on a meteorite or a piece of stellar debris that could have arrived on a meteorite or a piece of stellar debris from which our planet was created. Could the life on Earth be part of an even far older, far vaster entity? The universe. You are the universe, an intrinsic part of it. Ultimately, you are not a person, but a focal point where the universe is becoming conscious of itself.